Also a great appreciation for the great songs before 1920, in a period of time when the phonograph was just a talking piece around the house, and such great singers like Billy Murray, Henry Burr, Byron G. Harlan, Irving Kaufman, Octa Fields, great popular stars before the 20s.
Additionally, a deep admiration for the wonderful tunes that were in existence before to the year 1920, during a time when the phonograph was merely a talking device that was used around the house. Also included in this category are renowned vocalists such as Billy Murray, Henry Burr, Byron G. Harlan, Irving Kaufman, and Arthur Fields, who were all popular stars prior to the 1920s. In 1969, he tied the knot with a young lady who was only 17 years old on The Tonight Show, which was viewed by 45 million people. Tiny Tim's odd fall from grace began with that, but it was only the beginning. His obsession with taking showers, his preoccupation with adult diapers, and the obscene Christmas song that brought an end to his career were all factors that contributed to one horrific night that resulted in his being permanently banned from television. The bizarre and tragic tale that they never wanted you to know is finally revealed to you. The 12th of April, 1932 found Herbert Boutros Ghali being born in Manhattan, New York City. Tiny Tim was born on that day. Boutros Ghali, his father, was a textile worker from Beirut, Lebanon, and the son of a Maronite Catholic priest. He was working in the textile industry. Tilly Staff, his mother, was a Polish-Jewish textile worker who had come to the United States from Brest-Litovsk in 1914. There, she worked in the garment industry. The neighborhood in which they resided was Washington Heights, which was populated by immigrants who were looking for new chances. Although Herbert's parents put in a lot of effort to provide him with a secure upbringing, he never showed any interest in mundane activities. Although other children were playing outside, he was preoccupied with music. When he was 5 years old, his father brought home a wind-up gramophone and a record of Beautiful Ohio by Henry Burr that was played at 78 revolutions per minute. Because of that one record, everything was different. He continued to play it over and over again, absolutely captivated by it. Not only was it the melody, but it was also the sensation and the universe that it came up with. When he was 6 years old, he had already acquired a guitar and begun teaching himself how to play it. After some time had passed, he listened to Arthur Godfrey play the ukulele on the radio, and eventually, he became obsessed with playing the instrument. Not only was music a passion for him, but it was also his escape. Herbert would spend hours at the New York Public Library, searching through old phonograph records and sheet music from the early 1900s, in contrast to the majority of children his age, who would listen to whatever was fashionable at the end of the day. He had a strong desire to comprehend the music of the past, and by the time he was a preteen, he had a greater understanding of songs and performers that had been lost than the majority of historians. It was never a priority for him to attend school. He went to George Washington High School, but he had a difficult time succeeding academically and blending in with his peers. Math and science were uninteresting subjects for him. Music was the only thing that interested him. His sophomore year was marked by a string of failures, and he ultimately decided to withdraw from school. Unfortunately for his parents, he had already made up his mind about what he wanted to do with his life. In order to provide for himself, he worked a few menial jobs and did anything he could to make ends meet, yet his primary attention was on music. It was during this time that he made a discovery that would forever distinguish him from others. The great singer Rudy Vallee, who was active in the 1920s and was noted for his high, almost ghostly voice, was the artist that he had been listening to. Herbert was motivated to begin experimenting with singing in falsetto as a result of this observation. Initially, it was an odd sensation, yet there was something about it that felt natural. Later on, he referred to this particular time as a holy experience. It wasn't only a method of operation, it was his voice, and it revealed who he was. He was aware of the fact that Herbert Corey was not a name that stuck out from the crowd. He began playing under a variety of stage names in the hopes that one of them would become established. Because he was under the impression that the perfect name may bring him good fortune, he tried out names such as Larry Love, Derry Dover, Julian Foxglove, and Sir Timothy Timmins. None of them were successful. After that, in the year 1960, his management proposed an alternative moniker, one that was straightforward, yet humorous with its simplicity. A Little Tim. Although it was an odd option for someone who was 6 feet 1 inch tall, it was successful. The character in A Christmas Carol, who was delicate but hopeful, was the inspiration for this choice. A new persona emerged along with the new name. He grew his hair out to a considerable length, which was not something that was typical in the 1950s. He wore garb that was vivid and out of the ordinary, giving the impression that he had walked out of another century. He went so far as to powder his face white, believing that doing so would represent innocence and youth. After that, he was no longer merely a musician. Eventually, he would become a character. With his falsetto voice, his ukulele, and his old-fashioned tunes, Tiny Tim was unlike anything that anyone had ever seen before, and it wasn't long before the entire world began to pay notice. On the first day of his adventure, Tiny Tim found himself in one of the most peculiar areas in New York City. During the latter half of the 1950s, he gave performances at Hubert's Museum and Live Flea Circus, which was a dime museum, located in Times Square, and had been operating continuously. There were sideshow performers, sword swallowers, tattooed ladies, and even a flea circus, where real fleas pulled little chariots. The venue was full with people looking for entertainment. Tim the Tiny was a perfect fit. Under the guise of Larry Love, the singing canary, he gave performances, in which he sang classic Tin Pan Alley tunes, in his distinctive falsetto. Even in a room full of people who were strange, he stood out because of his height of 6 feet, his long hair, and the white makeup that he wore on his face. The nickname Human Canary was given to him by the crowds. There was a struggle and a training ground at Hubert's at the same time. The atmosphere of the freak show made it difficult for people to view him as a musician who takes his craft seriously. He was unique, even among those who were unique, yet the experience molded him into the person he became. He was able to master the technique of capturing the attention of an audience and embracing the peculiarity that distinguished him from others. By 1960, he had outgrown his position at Hubert's and moved to Greenwich Village in order to pursue more ambitious goals. The Village way of life was not an easy one. Tiny Tim performed under a variety of aliases, including Sir Timothy Timms and Derry Dover, and he appeared on any stage that would allow him to do so. Even though his manager George King exerted a lot of effort to bring him to people's attention, success did not arrive overnight. Early on, the majority of his gigs were unpaid. Small clubs, open mic nights, and even the famed Café Wolf, where a young Bob Dylan was just beginning his career, were all places where he performed whenever he had the opportunity. During certain evenings, he would perform in exchange for dinner. In 1963, he was able to secure a stable position at Page 3, a club that was owned by lesbians, and was located at the intersection of 7th Avenue and West 10th Street. Although he was only paid $96 a month, the club provided him with a genuine audience base. He gave performances for a crowd that was receptive to his eccentricities on 6 evenings out of the week. His performance of I Enjoy Being a Girl quickly became a favorite among the audience. At the third page, he completed the process of perfecting his ability to move between baritone and falsetto voices within the context of a single song. This was the point at which people started to recognize him, not as a mere circus act, but rather as a genuine artist. The mainstream music industry was at a loss for what to do with him, despite the fact that his fame was becoming more widespread in Greenwich Village. Individuals disregarded him as a novelty act due to his peculiar look and high-pitched voice. Nevertheless, during the early 1960s, the folk scene was flourishing, and his performances at establishments, such as the Fat Black Pussycat and Café Bizarre, began to garner attention. Talent scouts took note of him, but they were uncertain about how to position him in the market. Tiny Tim had his first appearance on the set of Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In in February of 1968, which marked the beginning of his meteoric journey to fame. The program was truly one of the most well-liked shows on television, recognized for its quick-witted comedy and unexpected guest appearances. Nobody anticipated what was going to take place after that. Tim, who was on the smaller side, entered the room while holding a shopping bag and a ukulele. His long locks framed his pale face. Co-host Dick Martin was completely unaware of his identity. Following then, Tiny Tim began singing in his high falsetto voice while tiptoeing through the tulips. He did this while wearing a brilliant smile. A few individuals in the audience laughed out loud. Others were perplexed and sat in silence. However, by the time his performance was drawing to a close, everyone was paying attention. At that very instant, he found himself becoming an overnight phenomenon. The latter half of the 1960s was a period of transition, and his peculiar appearance and mannerisms were perfectly in line with the era's emphasis on individual independence. However, he was more than just a performer. He was something that had never been seen before, something that was completely unique. However, producer George Schlatter had faith in him, despite the fact that NBC officials were uncertain about whether or not he would connect with mainstream audiences. Tiny Tim was invited to return as a recurring guest, and each appearance he made furthered his already impressive reputation. Due to his popularity on Laugh-In, he was offered a recording contract with Reprise Records, which is a record label owned by Frank Sinatra. This contract was signed later that year. God Bless Tiny Tim was the title of his first album, which was released in April of 1968. His unique approach was used to deliver a weird combination of vintage Tin Pan Alley melodies, vaudeville tunes, and original tracks. All of these songs were performed individually. Tiptoe Through the Tulips, the song that stood out the most, became an unexpected hit, climbing all the way up to number 17 on the Billboard Hot 100 music chart. Richard Perry, who would go on to collaborate with Carly Simon and Barbra Streisand, was the musician responsible for producing the record. With the addition of Perry's sumptuous orchestration, Tiny Tim's music was given a grand, almost cinematic look and feel. Several reviewers lauded the album for restoring classic American music that had been neglected. It was considered a joke by some people. However, the general audience adored it, and the record was a good seller. A piece called The Other Side, which included strange lyrics about melting ice caps, was one of the more peculiar tracks that were included on the album. It demonstrated a more profound and introspective aspect of Tiny Tim's artistic abilities. One More Song, titled I Got You Babe, featured him singing both parts, alternating between a deep baritone and a high falsetto. However, these were not only gimmicks, rather they were evidence of his vocal range and his creativeness in the theater. At the end of 1968, he was present everywhere. He was a guest on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, The Ed Sullivan Show, and The Jackie Gleason Show, among other television performances. As for Tiny Tim, he was a mystery to many. When he performed for mainstream audiences, he was considered a novelty act. He was a performer who was so peculiar that people were unable to determine whether he was being serious or joking. On the other hand, he was something more to certain people. Bob Dylan and Andy Warhol regarded him as an artist, someone who was reviving music that had been ignored for a long time. He had such a profound understanding of early American music that even legendary musicians like Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra revered him. It wasn't everyone who was a fan. There were detractors who referred to him as a gimmick, claiming that he used his oddities to conceal the fact that he lacked talent. He appeared to them to be nothing more than a peculiar guy who had been fortunate. But despite the fact that people had different opinions about him, he had become a sensation in the culture. Every single one of them was watching, regardless of whether they were laughing at him or applauding for him. Due to the fact that he appeared on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson more than 20 times between the years 1968 and the early 1970s, Tiny Tim became one of the most memorable guests in the history of the show. Since his initial appearance in April of 1968, everything has been different. Carson released his first album, which was titled God Bless Tiny Tim, and almost immediately after its release, it sold more than 200,000 copies. An unexpected increase in popularity occurred for his song Tip Through the Tulips, which soared all the way up to number 17 on the Billboard charts. This success was a direct result of the song's success. Tiny Tim was unlike anyone fans had ever seen before. He stood at 6 feet and 1 inch tall, had long hair, and had a falsetto voice. His ukulele was used to play traditional songs, and he brought a unique combination of weirdness and genuine musical aptitude to the performance. People were captivated by his performances, and even Carson appeared to be having a difficult time deciding between amusement and wonder. The audience couldn't get enough of it. Because of the large number of emails that NBC received requesting more, Tiny Tim became a frequent guest on the show. The enthusiasm that Tiny Tim brought to the show was something that Carson liked. His behavior was inexplicable. There would be a time when he was singing a love ballad from the 1920s, and then the next instant he would say something that was utterly unexpected. Because of this he became a guest that the audience had to watch. However, despite the fact that a great number of people adored him, there were some who were uncertain as to whether he was telling the truth or only acting out a character. To put it another way, he was one of the figures that received the most attention during that era. By the middle of the 1970s, things had shifted. The tastes of the general public shifted toward rock music and mainstream pop. As time went on, the novelty that had made Tiny Tim a famous figure began to fade away. It became less common for him to make appearances on The Tonight Show, and his fame started to wane subsequently. However, the time he spent with Carson had already turned into history. On December 17, 1969, Tiny Tim experienced the most significant occasion of his life. Live on The Tonight Show, Johnny tied the knot with Victoria Budinger, also known as Miss Vicky, who was only 17 years old. It was a television event that was unlike anything else. Nearly 1/4 of the population of the United States, or approximately 45 million individuals, tuned in to watch. The moon landing was the only event that had garnered more viewers during the 1960s. Carson saw to it that everyone was aware that it was genuine. Over the course of his monologue that evening, he informed the audience that some individuals have believed that we have been joking about Tiny Tim getting married on the show. Neither are we. Tulips from the Netherlands were used to embellish the set in the thousands. In accordance with Tiny Tim's request, Carson toasted the newlyweds with milk and honey rather than champagne when the ceremony came to a close. Because of the large number of individuals who stayed at home to watch the wedding, there was a reported decrease in the number of crimes that occurred that evening. In subsequent years, Tiny Tim referred to himself as the most talented individual in the entire nation. Nevertheless, his marriage did not endure. 8 years later, he and Miss Vicky went their own ways. At the time of their divorce, they had a single kid together. Despite the fact that their relationship came to an end, the wedding continued to be one of the most iconic events in the history of television coverage. There was a genuine admiration that Carson had for Tiny Tim. Tiny Tim was always given the opportunity to speak, whereas other guests were treated as though they were novelties or jokes. In addition to having an extraordinary understanding of music from the early 20th century, he was able to talk in great detail about old songs and performers who had been forgotten. This was something that Carson appeared to respect, and he frequently allowed him to convey his passion with the audience. In addition, Tiny Tim had a knack of taking Carson by surprise. Carson found himself briefly unable to articulate his thoughts after he casually disclosed his intention to wed Miss Vicky during one of his appearances. Carson used comedy to deal with the situation, and he allowed Tiny Tim to be himself regardless of how odd things became. In addition, Carson appeared to be protective of him. Although the audience chuckled at Tiny Tim's peculiar behavior, Carson made sure that the crowd's laughter did not escalate into full mockery. He was able to maintain a respectful demeanor, while also maintaining a sense of humor. The appearances of Tiny Tim become much more noticeable as a result of this. By the late 1970s, Tiny Tim's moment in the spotlight had passed. His performance, once vibrant and original, struggled to keep up with changing times. He continued appearing in smaller settings like community centers and circuses, but the major TV appearances were done. The worst blow came when Reprise Records dumped him. Without a label backing him, his career experienced a severe fall. Instead of giving up, he tried to take charge of his own future. In 1971, he created Victim Records, a name that linked his with his wife's, Miss Vicky. The label issued 5 singles over the course of the following year, but none of them were successful in gaining traction. As a result of the project's failure, Victim Records came to an end in 1972. Not long after, he launched another label called Toilet Records, a name that matched how he felt about his career at the moment. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, he continued to record music, but mainly for minor record labels the entire time. As a result of his albums' limited success, some of them were only released in foreign countries. As his career in the mainstream fell by the wayside, he began performing at any venue that would have him. He even performed his act in other countries, in addition to performing at community centers and high school theaters. However, despite the fact that he recorded records in Australia in the late 1970s, they were only produced in limited quantities, and were never released in the United States market.
Despite the fact that he was no longer playing at prominent places, he continued to take the stage. If there is one thing that Victim Records demonstrated, it is that Tiny Tim was not prepared to leave the entertainment industry at that time. By the late 1970s, and far into the 1980s, he was able to secure employment in locations where the majority of former celebrities would not have dared to go. As time went on, he established himself as a fixture on the carnival circuit, performing in punk clubs, gay nightclubs, and any other place that were willing to have him. It's possible that some people might have interpreted this as a step down, but Tiny Tim saw it as an opportunity to continue doing what he loved. He joined Roy Reagan's Vaudeville Review, which was one of the most peculiar moves he had made in his professional life. This traveling show featured underappreciated performers and peculiar novelty acts who performed in intimate venues all over the United States. In addition to that, he went on a tough tour of 36 weeks with a circus. Although the working conditions were difficult and the remuneration was not as high as it had been in the past, he was still performing in front of an audience. He discovered an unexpected following in the punk rock movement, despite the fact that he was a long way from his legendary status in Las Vegas. Punk music is characterized by its rebellious spirit, which is well suited to his peculiar style, and his reluctance to conform. Brave Combo, a Texas polka band that is well known for its unique style, was one of the bands that he performed with. It was a transition for him from being a popular freak to becoming a figure in the underground cult, and he was happy about it. Following that, there were the undertakings that left people either perplexed or shocked, or both. Santa Claus Has Got the AIDS, This Year, was the title of a song that he published by him in the year 1985. The reaction was almost instantaneous. Numerous individuals, during the height of the AIDS crisis, regarded the song as being callous and insulting. It was later claimed by Tiny Tim that the candy had nothing to do with the sickness, but rather was a reference to AIDS, which was an appetite suppressant sweet that had been discontinued owing to its bad name. No matter what he intended, the dispute tarnished his reputation even further. If that wasn't bizarre enough, in 1987, he starred in Blood Harvest, a low-budget slasher thriller directed by Bill Ribon. Marvelous Mervo, the character he played, was a clown who played the ukulele and was just as frightening as the concept of the movie itself. The picture flopped, and critics tore it apart, but over time it became a cult favorite. Tiny Tim was one of the most bizarre artists of his day. It was his high-pitched voice and his passion for older tunes that brought him fame, but his personal life was even odd. He had behaviors that were nearly impossible to explain, despite the fact that he played the ukulele and had an enormous smile. From extraordinary hygiene routines to weird spending habits, everything about him was out of the usual. He was obsessed with staying clean. He did not merely act in a typical manner, rather, he went to an extreme. It was alleged that he had not skipped a single shower since the 20th of December in 1989, and he said that he took showers anywhere from 4 to 6 times every day. Cleaning was more than simply a routine for him. It was a way of life. It was something that he believed was essential for maintaining one's purity. Even drying off would have to be done in a particular manner. He was adamant about not using standard towels since he believed that they were contaminated with germs. Rather than that, he relied solely on throwaway paper towels, most notably, those of the Job Squad, or Bounty microwave variety. His hygiene routine included more than just taking a shower. Crest, McLean's and Gleam were the 3 types of toothpaste that he used to clean his teeth 4 times a day. He also used a combination of the 3 brands. It was his belief that this mixture gave his teeth a luster that was unparalleled, and that was just the beginning of his preoccupation with appearance. His expenditures on cosmetics amounted to enormous sums of money. He wasn't trying to hide his weaknesses by making himself appear younger. Beauty was something that he just admired, and he desired to surround himself with it. In order to feel more connected to attractive ladies, he would occasionally purchase makeup. His bosses were always complaining about his spending, describing it as irresponsible, and making him appear juvenile. There were a few of his other behaviors that were even more peculiar. Adult diapers were something that he was quite interested in, and he would discuss them with anyone who was willing to listen. At one point, He ordered everything that was offered on the menu of a hotel, not because he was hungry but because he wanted to arrange the food in a way that was artistically striking. After everything was finished, he left without having even a single mouthful of the food. Even the act of eating was something on which he took a different approach. He abhorred eating in front of other people, including his wife. Instead, he would sit by himself and act as if he were the host of a lavish dinner party, acting out the roles of each individual visitor during the event. In the same way that his routines were peculiar, so was his personal life. It was his relationship with Victoria May Budinger, sometimes known as Miss Vicky, that brought him the most notoriety. In front of 45 million viewers, he tied the knot with her on the November 17, 1969 episode of The Tonight Show, which was hosted by Johnny Carson. Over the course of the decade, it was the second most watched television event, with only the moon landing being the most watched. During that time period, he was 37 years old, she was only 17 years old. Despite the fact that the age difference of 20 years sparked immediate criticism, the spectacle of the wedding was the only thing that anyone could talk about. Extravagance was present at the ceremony. Jeffrey Martin was responsible for designing the clothing that the pair wore, which were fashioned in a Victorian manner. Additionally, the stage was decked with 10,000 tulips that were imported from Holland as a tribute to Martin's classic song, Tiptoe Through the Tulips. However, from the beginning of their marriage, there were problems. In a later statement, Miss Vicky stated that they desired entirely different things. In contrast to Tiny Tim, who was solely concerned with his professional life, she wished for a life of stability and family. In total, they were blessed with a daughter, who they called Tulip Victoria. They had already moved out of each other's homes by the time they celebrated their second wedding anniversary. Even though Miss Vicky was 19 years old when she gave birth, Tiny Tim was not present. It was in 1977 when the couple finalized their divorce. Later on, however, she stated that she did not have any regrets. As a young girl who was completely engrossed in the moment, she had enthusiastically embraced the experience since it had been so exciting. Little Tim went on to marry twice more. His marriage to Jean Elvis, whom he referred to as Miss John, took place in 1984. However, the marriage only lasted for a period of 6 months until the couple divorced. It was reported by many who were close to him that his erratic conduct and his unwillingness to settle down were contributing factors to the issue. Susan Marie Gardner, sometimes known as Miss Sue, was his third wife. She had been a fan of his ever since she was 12 years old during their time together. When she reached out to him when they were on tour, it was the beginning of their relationship. Immediately after they had their first encounter, he inquired as to whether or not she thought of herself as very attractive. The couple eventually tied the knot in August of 1995, despite the difficult beginning, and they continued to reside together in Minneapolis until his passing. It was his perspective on commitment that was one of the most peculiar aspects of his romantic relationships. During the evening of his wedding with Miss Vicky, he disclosed to her that he intended to continue seeing other women. Her reaction was one of shock, but this was simply how he viewed romantic partnerships. His universe was his own, and he lived according to his own set of rules. It didn't matter if it was about personal cleanliness, finances or marriage. Tiny Tim never did things the way people anticipated him to. The passion that Tiny Tim had for performing never diminished, in spite of the fact that his body began to fail him. At the UK Expo, which was held in Montague, Massachusetts, on September 28, 1996, he made his debut on stage with his trademark voice and ukulele. He had spent decades entertaining people. He was 64 years old at the time when he sang his first song that evening. He hardly made it through it. The unexpected collapse of his body onto the platform, face first, occurred as he was standing in front of 135 people. Before the arrival of the paramedics, the audience remained motionless and stunned because they were afraid of the worst. Some people started crying. In an effort to stabilize him, the medical staff at Franklin Medical Center in Greenfield, where he was brought, worked diligently. After 11 days of being in intensive care, he was finally released from the facility in a critical condition.